Hello and welcome to this video on pivot table functionality within Microsoft Excel. So first let's look at what are pivot tables. So in its most basic form, a pivot table takes data and summarizes it so you can make sense of it. And this can be done without creating any formula or writing even a single line of code. Right. So let's take an example. We have a data set which has date, a buyer. So this is the data for the products that are bought by buyers, and it's categorized by the type of the buyer, and it has the date when the product or when the transaction happened, right? So we have a column for date, which is basically the transaction date. We have a column for buyer, which identifies who the buyer is. We have a column for type, which is the type of item or the product that was bought, right? And then we have the amount paid to buy that particular product or service, right? So we have this data. So there are 4 columns and we have around 7 rows, right? So it's a very simple data set, right? And this is more like raw data, right? So this is not summarized. This is each individual transaction and one corresponding row for that each individual transaction, right? And let's say we want to get a summary of how much the total dollar amount spent, right, by buyer. So let's say we want a summary of how much was bought by dad, how much was bought by mom, and how much by Kelly, right? What we can do is we can create a pivot table, and that pivot table can help us summarize the dollar amounts, right, by buyer. Likewise, if we want a summary by type, we can create a pivot table which summarizes data by type, right? If there is data for the same date, right? So let's say there are multiple transactions happening on any given date, right? We might also want to have a summary view for a given day, right? Wherein we will summarize by the date column. So with pivot tables, as long as you have your data structured in the form of rows and columns, you can easily create multiple summarized views, right, on top of that data, right? So this covers the basic concept of what a pivot table is, and now let's go in. We will take this data and we'll put it into a separate Excel spreadsheet, right? And we'll start creating some pivots on top of this, right? So I do Control C, I right click on Excel here, I open up a new Excel workbook, right? I will select a blank workbook and I will do a Control V, right? So I have my data here, and now what I'll do is I'll click anywhere on this data set, right? And I go to Insert and I'll say Insert a pivot table, right? Now when I'm saying Insert a pivot table, I can go in and specify what is the range of my input data, right? So in this case, by default, Excel selected the entire data set as the default range, but you can pick and choose. Let's say you wanted just column 2 to column 7, right? And you want to ignore column 8, that can also be done, right? But by default, the create pivot table functionality would include all the data that is there in your current worksheet, right? And you have an option, you can include in your pivot table in the same worksheet, or you can create a completely new worksheet, right? and for that pivot table, right? So in our case, we will say create a new worksheet, and we'll click on OK, right? So now what has happened is Excel created a new worksheet, right? And it has added this pivot table, right? So on the right hand side, if you see, Excel has included all the columns that were there in our data set, right? So we had 4 columns: date, buyer, type, and amount. So all of those show up here, right? And what we can do is very easily we can create multiple summaries. So let's say the very first thing that we need to decide is what column or what field we want to summarize, right? So in our case, it's the amount. So if we select amount, by default, Excel has added amount to the values region, right? And it is trying to calculate the sum of the values, right? So what we did was we selected amount. Amount was added to the values section of the pivot table definition, right? And by default, that value type is sum, which means that it will sum all the values available in that column, right? So we click on OK. Now let's say we want to get a summary by buyer, right? So all we need to do is click on buyer. So buyer is now added to the rows section of the pivot table, right? And here what we see is a row got added for each unique buyer in our data set, right? So we had 3 unique buyers in our data set: mom, dad, and Kelly, right? So a row got added to each unique buyer, and Excel automatically calculated the sum, right? Now let's say for each buyer, we also want a breakup of what type of product was bought by that particular buyer. So what we can do is we can select type here, right? And we can move type to the column section in our pivot table definition, right? So what this has done is we already had the rows for the buyer. It has added the product type, it has added a column for each unique product type, right? So we have book, we have food, fuel, music, sport, tickets, right? And then it is calculating the sum by each of these, right? So if we look at this particular cell, so this has the amount spent by dad for buying sporting products, right? This cell has the amount spent by Kelly buying music videos or music CDs, right? Or maybe music books, right? This column represents the total amount spent by Kelly, right? Buying books, right? This cell represents mom spent buying food, right? And then this Excel by default would add a column for the grand total, right? And a row for the grand total, right? So this is the total amount spent by the family on books. This is the total amount spent on food, right? And then this is the total amount spent by dad, right? Across the different product categories, right? So you see, it's very simple. As long as your input data is structured, it's organized in the form of columns and rows, right? And then and as long as it's structured, you can very quickly create a pivot table, and you can create different views, right? As to how to summarize that information. Now, another feature is if we, let's say, want to filter some of this data, right? Let's say I want to filter it by date, right? So what we can do is we can we can move this here, right? The date column. And here, if you see in the filter, we will get all the dates by months here, right? And here we can pick and choose which ones that we want to be included in the pivot table. So there is an option wherein we can apply a filter on top of a pivot table. So for now, we will take this month. I'll put it back, right? And we will move even date outside. So that's it. We covered some very basic concepts around a pivot table. In another video, we will look at some advanced concepts around pivot tables as to how to add more visualizations on top of pivot tables. So thanks for watching.